The signal was wrong. That was the first thing Counselor Veth Saron noticed when the archive request came through, not the content of the request, not the origin coordinates, but the timestamp embedded in the transmission header. It was dated using a human calendar system. A system that hadn't been used in active communication for 117 years. She almost dismissed it as a corrupted file. Almost. Instead, she set it aside and went to her window, looking out at the slow rotation of Conclave Station's outer ring, at the traffic of 11 species moving through docking corridors in careful, practiced choreography. Merchant vessels, diplomatic shuttles, the occasional research cruiser, the galaxy functioning. The galaxy as it had functioned for over a century now, without a particular kind of noise that nobody talked about anymore. Without a particular kind of presence that had once made every council session run 15 minutes longer than necessary, that had introduced variables into every negotiation, that had caused 3 separate wars to end in ways their instigators had not anticipated and could not fully explain. The galaxy had been quieter for 117 years. She had grown up in that quiet. She pulled the transmission back open and read it again. It was addressed to the Conclave Historical Archive, specifically to the department that managed what were called closed species records, the bureaucratic category that housed documentation on civilizations that no longer maintained active galactic presence. It was a dry administrative category. Most requests came from academics, from students writing dissertations on extinct cultures, from museums seeking artifact authentication. This request was asking for something different. It was asking for a full copy of every diplomatic agreement, every military engagement record, every territorial boundary map, and every biological survey that the Conclave had ever compiled on a species called humanity, to be transmitted to a set of coordinates that, when Veth Saron checked them against the navigation database, returned an error she had never seen before in 12 years of Conclave service. Not unknown coordinates, not unregistered coordinates. Coordinates that the system flagged as restricted access, historical incident zone entry requires Tier 9 clearance. She had Tier 7 clearance. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she did something she would later struggle to explain to her superiors, something that violated 3 separate administrative protocols and required her to use an access code she'd been given at the start of her posting and told she would likely never need. She didn't request permission. She didn't file a preliminary inquiry. She didn't wait for the morning shift supervisor to arrive. She forwarded the transmission to the office of Fleet Admiral Doreth Ken with a single line of her own appended to it, a line that felt absurd even as she typed it. I think you need to see this before anyone else does. Admiral Doreth Ken was not the kind of person who alarmed easily. He had served in the Conclave fleet for 41 years. He had overseen the Marin corridor suppression, the Volthek biological incident, and the slow, grinding decade of the reformist uprisings on 4 separate colony systems. He had seen, as he sometimes told junior officers with a kind of tired authority, the full range of ways that civilizations could fail each other. When Veth Saron's message arrived, he was in the middle of a budget review, which was by his measure the most dangerous thing a senior officer could be doing because it made a person believe the galaxy was primarily an accounting problem. He read the transmission. He read it again. He called Veth Saron directly, bypassing the standard request queue, which made her slightly dizzy because in 12 years no one had ever called her directly. The coordinates, he said without preamble. You checked them. Yes, Admiral, and the timestamp. Yes, a silence that lasted long enough that she checked her connection to make sure it hadn't dropped. Where did you receive this? He asked. It came through the standard archive request channel, publicly accessible. Anyone could have sent it. Another silence, longer this time. Cancel your next 4 days of scheduled duties, he said finally. Tell your department head you've been assigned to a fleet administrative review. Don't specify which fleet. Come to level 12, section R. Don't use your personal identification tag on the lift. The call ended. She stood in her office for a moment, looking at the transmission still open on her screen, at those coordinates the system didn't want her to see, at the human calendar timestamp that shouldn't exist. Outside her window, the galaxy continued its careful choreography. 11 species, diplomatic shuttles, the quiet that everyone had grown up in. She began to wonder, for the first time in her professional life, what exactly the quiet was covering. Level 12, Section R was not on any map she had access to. She found it by following a series of directions Admiral Doreth Ken had transmitted through a communications method, so outdated her personal device needed 3 minutes to decode the format. When she arrived, the corridor looked like every other corridor on the station's administrative levels. The same lighting, the same wall texture, the same faint hum of environmental systems. But the door at the end of it had no interface panel, no badge reader, no visible mechanism of any kind. The Admiral was already there. So were 2 other people she didn't recognize, both in civilian clothes, both watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not suspicion, not welcome. Something in between that she gradually identified. as she stood in that corridor trying not to look uncertain as careful assessment. She's the one who caught it, Dorothy Ken said to the two civilians, and the way he said it caught it, as if the transmission were something that could have got past them, made her understand that her next few days were not going to resemble any administrative review she'd ever been part of. The door opened, though she saw no one touch anything. Inside was a room she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe and consistently failing. Not because it was large, it wasn't. Not because it contained anything visually extraordinary. It contained 4 chairs, a table, a display screen, and a wall covered from floor to ceiling in physical documents. Actual printed paper, organized in a system she couldn't immediately parse, connected by lines drawn directly on the wall in several colors. She recognized one word, repeated across multiple documents connecting multiple threads of color, written larger than anything else on that wall. Threshold. "Sit down," said one of the civilians, a woman whose name Veth Saron wouldn't learn for another 2 days. "We need to explain to you what you've actually found. And we need to do it in the right order, because if we don't, you'll misunderstand it the same way everyone else did." "Everyone else," Veth Saron said. "Who is everyone else?" The woman looked at the admiral looked at the wall. "The conclave," he said. "The 11 species, every diplomat, every military analyst, every xenobiologist who filed a report on human civilization between 300 years ago and 117 years ago." He paused. "Everyone who concluded that humanity was finished." "They were wrong," said the other civilian, a man who had been standing in the corner and who now moved to the display screen and activated it with a gesture. "We've known they were wrong for about 6 months. We've been trying to figure out what to do about it." The screen lit up. The coordinates appeared, and underneath them a sensor reading that Veth Saron stared at for a long time before she processed what she was seeing. Life signs, thousands of them, human life signs. Coming from a region of space that the Conclave had formally designated uninhabitable, had filed under Historical Incident Zone, had quietly, collectively, and very deliberately stopped thinking about. Coming from the place where 117 years ago the last documented human fleet had made its final jump and disappeared. His name was Yi-10, and he was 26 years old, and he had never seen a star up close. He'd seen images, of course. Everyone had. The archive ships carried petabytes of visual documentation. Sunrises over coastlines that no longer existed, cities photographed from orbit. The particular blue of a planetary sky that several of the elders, when they thought no one was listening, still talked about in the present tense, as if it were a place you could go back to rather than a coordinate in the past. He'd grown up understanding that Earth was a word that meant something different to different generations. To his grandparents' generation it was a proper noun, capitalized, the name of something specific and lost. To his parents' generation it was complicated, a grief they'd inherited but not lived. To his generation it was both of those things and also something more functional, a direction, not backward, forward. He was running system diagnostics on the 3rd hydroponics bay when the proximity alert sounded. Not an alarm, they rarely used the full alarm system anymore, had learned over decades that sustained high alert states did specific and measurable damage to human cognition that they could not afford but a tone. A specific tone he'd heard in drills but never in actual operation. External contact. Unknown origin. He was at the bridge in 4 minutes, which was good time for someone who had to cross 6 levels and 2 pressurized corridors, and when he arrived, Coordinator Adiz Obi was already there, standing in front of the long-range display with her hands clasped behind her back in the posture that meant she was working something through and didn't want to be interrupted. He interrupted her anyway. "Origin?" he asked. "Conclave frequency," she said. The bridge went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. There were 11 people present. In the space of 3 seconds, all 11 of them stopped doing whatever they were doing, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a ripple, one person noticing, then another, until the room held the specific quality of stillness that comes from many people not quite daring to speak first. "Conclave," said someone behind him. He didn't turn to see who. As in the Galactic Conclave," Adiz said. "Yes, they know we're here. They've known for approximately 6 hours based on the transmission timestamp. This is them asking if we know they know." She turned from the display. She had a face that was very good at not showing things, which Yi-1 had always found both admirable and slightly unnerving. "They're also asking something else." "What?" She turned back to the display, and he followed her gaze, and he read the message for the first time, the full message, not the alert summary he'd caught from the corridor. It said in a standard conclave diplomatic format he recognized from historical documents, an invitation to preliminary contact negotiations. It listed protocols. It listed proposed neutral locations. It referred to humanity, in the language of those protocols, as a recovered population. A phrase with a specific bureaucratic meaning in conclave taxonomy, it applied to species that had survived some category of catastrophic decline and were seeking reintegration. He read it twice. "They think we need reintegration," he said. They think, Adiz said carefully, that we've been surviving, that we've been enduring, that we've been waiting. A pause. They don't know what we've been doing. Should we tell them? She looked at him with an expression that was, for just a moment, more complicated than her usual composure suggested. Something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite sorrow and occupied the space between the two in a way he didn't have a word for. Not yet, she said. Not all at once. Counselor Veth Saron had requested every available record on humanity. It took her 3 days to understand why the records felt wrong, and another day to understand what they were missing, and a 5th day to sit in the Section R room alone, the Admiral having been called away to something she wasn't briefed on, and simply read. What she read told the story in the way the Conclave had always told it. A species that had overextended. A species that had made enemies efficiently and made peace clumsily. A species that had, through a combination of territorial aggression, biological vulnerability, and what one analyst in a 300-year-old report called an apparent inability to accurately assess their own limitations, found themselves in an unwinnable position. The Conclave had not destroyed humanity. This was the part that every internal document was careful to note, a carefulness that she now read differently than she might have a week ago. The Conclave had not intervened. The Conclave had formally, diplomatically, and through a series of votes that were recorded in meticulous detail, declined to intervene. There was a distinction, the documents insisted, between those two things. The Kreth volley had destroyed humanity, or had come close enough in the aftermath of what the records called the cascading engagement, that by the time the last human fleet made its final jump, the working assumption of every Conclave member species was that it was over. The jump had been into a region designated by Conclave cartography as the Null Band, an area of space considered unnavigable, uninhabitable, and largely uninteresting. The assumption had been that the humans had jumped to die somewhere the Kreth volley couldn't follow, rather than die somewhere they could. The assumption had been, she now understood, wrong. But she kept getting stuck on something that wasn't in the records, something the records kept circling around without naming. Every document from the period just before the cascading engagement contained the same texture of surprise, not that humanity was losing, because many species had read that outcome as likely, but surprise at specific moments within the losing. Surprise at decisions that made no strategic sense. Surprise at the persistence of human forces in engagements where retreat was clearly the rational option. Surprise most consistently at what one military analyst had termed the absence of the expected capitulation threshold. Every species in the Conclave had one, a point observable and broadly predictable at which a civilization under existential pressure shifted from resistance to negotiation. It wasn't weakness. It was rationality. It was survival calculus. You preserved what you could, you accepted what couldn't be changed, you made the most of what remained. Humanity had not done this. The records showed calculation after calculation, projection after projection, each one predicting the moment humanity would reach its threshold. And each one, filed weeks or months later, noted in the dry language of retrospective analysis that the threshold had not occurred, that human forces had continued past the point where continuation made sense. That humans had, by every measurable metric, chosen costs that could not be justified by any expected gain. She read a report from a Conclave observer who had been stationed near the cascading engagement's final phase. It had been filed 118 years ago, and read in its first paragraph like a standard military assessment. By its third paragraph it read differently. The behavior observed does not correspond to any resistance model in current Conclave use. The human forces engaged at Meridian Station continued active operation for a period of 72 standard hours following the destruction of their primary command structure and the confirmed deaths of their senior command staff. No new command structure emerged. The engagement continued anyway. Individual vessel commanders operating without coordination, without strategic guidance, and with no coherent objective remaining, continued to engage a vastly superior force. When asked via open channel to state their objective, the response from one vessel was the following: "We're keeping you here." This observer does not know what we were being kept from. As of filing, this remains unclear. The human fleet at Meridian Station was fully destroyed. Whatever they were keeping us from, it is not apparent what was accomplished. She read that paragraph 4 times. Then she pulled up the navigational records from the same period, and started tracing the movements of every other human vessel, everywhere in the operational zone during those 72 hours. Yi1 had been chosen to go to the preliminary contact meeting because Coordinator Adiz didn't want to go herself, and when he asked her why, she gave him an answer that took him a few hours to fully understand. "Because I know too much about what they did," she said, "and I might let it show. And I don't know enough. You know everything that matters, you know how we got here, you know what it cost." She paused. "But you don't carry it the same way I do. You can meet them and let them see something real without letting them see everything. We're not ready for them to see everything." The preliminary meeting was conducted in deep space at neutral coordinates on a conclave diplomatic vessel called the Equinox. Yi-1 arrived on a ship called the Remnant, which was a name that made conclave diplomatic staff visibly uncomfortable in a way he pretended not to notice. The conclave delegation consisted of 5 people, including Councillor Veth Saron, whose manner he immediately registered as different from the others, more watchful, less composed in her pretense of composure. She was the one who'd found the transmission. He knew this because Adiz had told him. She was the one who'd spent 5 days reading the records. He was curious whether she'd found the right thing in them yet. The meeting began formally. Introductions, protocols. The conclave delegation presented what they called a reintegration framework politely, warmly, with the practiced care of people trying not to say anything wrong while not being entirely certain what wrong would look like. He listened. He accepted the documents they provided. He did not yet offer anything in return beyond his name and his title, which was mission representative, a title they'd invented for this occasion because the human governance structure that would have produced an appropriate title for a moment like this had not yet been fully rebuilt, and they had decided that inventing a title was better than explaining why. After approximately 40 minutes of careful exchange, Councillor Veth Saron said something that wasn't in the formal agenda. "May I ask," she said, "a personal question outside of the formal record?" "You can ask," he said. "The null band," she said. "How did you survive it?" "Every survey we had indicated it was exactly what your surveys said it was," he said. "Radiation fields that disrupted navigation systems, gravitational anomalies that stressed hull integrity, an effective absence of harvestable resources in any standard configuration." He paused. "We lost 40% of our population in the first 11 years. The delegation was quiet. "Then how?" began one of the others. "Because we didn't need it to be survivable," he said. "We needed it to be survivable enough, and we needed it to be something you wouldn't follow us into." A pause. "You didn't follow us. We thought." "I know what you thought." He said it without heat, without accusation, with something that was harder to respond to than either of those things. "We knew what you would think, that was part of it." Veth Saron was looking at him with the expression of someone doing rapid and complicated arithmetic. "Part of it," she said. He looked at her and said nothing because Adiz had told him this was the moment to say nothing, and Adiz, who carried things he couldn't fully imagine carrying, had been right about most things for as long as he'd known her. She went back to the records that night. She didn't sleep. She found it at 4 in the morning, station time. The thing that had been in the records the whole time, the thing the records had been carefully, collectively, and perhaps unconsciously arranged to obscure. Not through deception, she thought. Through the simpler mechanism of people seeing what they expected to see and filing what they saw, and never quite looking at the gap between the separate accounts. She pulled up the navigational records from the final phase of the cascading engagement. She traced the movements of every human vessel during the 72 hours that the forces at Meridian Station had fought without objective, without command, without strategic reason. The other vessels had not been fighting. The other vessels had been moving, in a specific direction, through a corridor that had only been open because human forces at Meridian Station and 6 other locations had simultaneously held Kreth Valley attention fixed in place. The vessels that had been fighting without objective had been creating an objective for someone else. For a convoy of human ships she had not noticed until now because they were not military vessels and had not been logged in the engagement records but in the civilian movement records that no analyst at the time had thought to cross-reference against the battle data. Ships carrying not weapons. Ships carrying people, ships carrying genetic archives, medical databases. Every seed bank, every cultural record, every piece of documentation that could be compressed and loaded into whatever cargo space remained in whatever vessels could move. While human forces fought at Meridian Station for 72 hours without reason that any conclave analyst could identify, a convoy of human civilian ships had slipped through the corridor created by that fight, had reached the jump coordinates, and had jumped into the null band. The Kreth Valley had looked at the battle and seen a last stand. The Conclave had looked at it and seen irrational persistence. Neither of them had looked at the civilian movement records. She sat with this understanding for a long time. Outside the archive screen the station hummed. The galaxy went about its careful business. She thought about 40% of a population dying in 11 years in a region of space designed to kill them. She thought about the ones who didn't die. She thought about what you would have to be, what you would have to decide about yourself and about the future, to survive 40% casualties and continue. To survive it not as a catastrophe but as the cost that had been anticipated and accepted in advance. To know before you jumped that this was the price and to jump anyway. She thought about the human at Meridian Station who had answered the question, "What is your objective?" with the words, "We're keeping you here." She thought about the fact that the person who said that had known when they said it, that they were not going to survive the next 72 hours. She thought about the fact that they had said it anyway. She thought about the word threshold on the wall of Section R, and she finally understood what it meant, and what it had always meant in every document and every analysis, and what every analyst who had ever used it had fundamentally misunderstood. They had been looking for humanity's threshold, the point at which humans would stop, would assess, would accept the rational outcome and choose survival over continuation. But humanity had not been trying to survive the cascading engagement. Humanity had been trying to survive past it. Those were not the same thing. There were 11 ships. That was what Yi-1 told Veth Saron on the second day of negotiations, when she came to him not as part of the formal delegation but alone, in the corridor outside the meeting room, 20 minutes before the scheduled session, with the look of someone who had been awake all night with a question that couldn't wait. When we jumped, he said, there were 11 ships. 11, she repeated. The military records would have you believe there were more. There weren't. Everything else was a feint. He paused. 11 ships, approximately 4,000 people, a very large amount of cargo. She was quiet. 4,000, she said, and the number sat in the corridor air between them. My grandmother was one of them. She was 9 years old. He said this without particular inflection. As a fact, she died when I was 14, natural causes, which was considered something of a victory by that point. How many are you now? He looked at her and she had the impression, briefly and uncomfortably, that she was being evaluated rather than simply observed. That behind the ordinary human face and the calm voice there was something measuring her, not with hostility, not with coldness, but with the particular patience of a person who has learned to be careful about what they reveal and to whom. More than 4,000, he said. How many more? Enough, he said, to matter. She thought about what enough to matter meant when it came from a species that had organized a successful civilization preservation operation in the middle of a military catastrophe, that had survived a region of space rated uninhabitable, that had spent 117 years in silence, not because they were hiding, and not because they were dying, but because they were. She groped for the right framing and found it and felt something go cold in her chest when she did. Because they were building. What did you do out there? She asked. For 117 years, what have you been doing? He was quiet for a moment. We asked ourselves a question, he said. In the beginning, when we were still in the null band and the losses were very bad and there were people who said we should try to reach conclave space, that we should ask for help, that we should accept whatever terms were available. A pause. We asked ourselves what we were doing, whether we were surviving or whether we were building. Because those are different things. Surviving, you make decisions based on what is. Building, you make decisions based on what isn't yet. And you chose building. We chose building, and building is slower, and it is harder, and in the first generation especially it cost things that people would not have chosen to pay if they had fully understood the cost in advance. He looked at the corridor wall, at nothing in particular, but we didn't come back to the galaxy as survivors asking for reintegration. We came back because we're ready to be here. Ready to be here, she said. The Conclave's reintegration framework, he said, it's very thoughtful, we've reviewed it carefully, we appreciate it. But it assumes we're starting from where we were 117 years ago, that we need the Conclave to help us reestablish, that we're a recovered population looking for a place in a structure that exists. He looked at her again with that measuring patience. We're not a recovered population, counselor, we're a founding population. The morning session began on time. Yi-1 sat across from the Conclave delegation and was polite and specific and gave nothing away that wasn't already visible. He was, Veth Saron thought, extraordinarily good at this, at revealing the shape of something enormous by the precise placement of the details he chose to share. By the end of the session, the Conclave delegation had understood 3 things. First, that humanity was not asking for reintegration. Second, that humanity was proposing something else, a relationship between equals, defined by new terms rather than the old ones. Third, that the population Yi-1 represented was significantly larger and significantly more prepared than the word 11 ships had implied. What they had not yet understood, what she suspected they were not yet being allowed to understand, was what humanity had spent 117 years building toward. What the question "are we surviving, or are we building" had led to, in practice in the null band, across 4 generations of human beings who had grown up knowing the story and deciding what to do with it. She found out 3 days later, when Adiz Obi arrived in person on a ship that was not the Remnant. Adiz Obi was 63 years old and moved like someone who had learned long ago that efficiency was more important than appearance. She came to the meeting without delegation, without ceremony, without anything except a hard drive containing the full record of 117 years of human activity, which she set on the table in front of the Conclave delegation without preamble. Everything on that drive is true, she said. We've verified it internally 6 times and we're happy to have it verified externally. It is not a threat, it is not a negotiating position, it is documentation. Veth Saron looked at the drive and then at Adiz and then at Yi-1, who was sitting to Adiz's right with his hands folded on the table, and an expression that she was now reading correctly as not calm but controlled. She had known by then that whatever was on the drive would force the Conclave to recalculate. She had not known what form the recalculation would take. The drive contained, among other things, population census records showing a current human population of 312,000 across 47 established settlements, resource extraction and manufacturing records, agricultural systems adapted from the original seed banks, and an educational archive that documented every generation's systematic transmission of human knowledge. These things were large. These things were remarkable. They were not the thing that made Veth Saron's hands go still in her lap. The thing that made her hands go still was the last section of the drive. It was a record of communications, specifically the communications that had gone out from human settlements over the past 11 years, not to the Conclave, not to any galactic authority, but to other species. Individual contacts, one at a time, careful and quiet, scientists sharing research, historians sharing archives. Offers of exchange made to civilizations that had grievances with the current conclave structure, not threats, not recruitment, just conversations, the kind of conversations that build relationships slowly over years. 11 years of conversations, with 17 different species. We weren't alone out there, Adiz said. Not entirely. The null band has edges and edges have neighbors. She paused. We had a long time to think about what we wanted to come back to. What kind of galaxy we wanted to come back to, what relationships we wanted to have when we arrived. She said it simply, without triumph, without satisfaction, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone reporting on work that had been completed and had cost what it had cost and was what it was. You've been building alliances, said one of the conclave delegation. We've been building relationships, Adiz said. There's a difference. Alliances are transactional, relationships are structural. A pause. We have no interest in threatening the conclave. We have no interest in undermining the conclave. What we have is a proposal for what the conclave becomes next, informed by what it was missing the last time we were in it. Informed by the 117 years we spent thinking about what that absence meant. The delegation was quiet. Veth Saron was thinking about a 9-year-old girl on a ship in the null band. About 4,000 people who had anticipated 40% casualties and jumped anyway. About the 72 hours at Meridian Station and the corridor that had opened because of them, and the ships that had moved through it and what those ships had been carrying. She was thinking about the answer to a question she had spent 2 weeks inside. Not what had humanity done to survive, but what had humanity understood that the conclave had not understood, not in 300 years of interaction, not in all the records, not in all the analyses. She thought she understood it now. The conclave's model of a civilization under pressure assumed that the goal of survival was to preserve what existed, to protect the current form, to minimize losses on the way to a future that would resemble the present. Humanity had decided at some point in the catastrophe that this was the wrong goal, that the goal was not to preserve what existed but to preserve the capacity to create something that didn't exist yet, that the question was not how do we keep what we have but what are we becoming. And that question, that specific reorientation, that particular inversion of the survival instinct from conservation to construction, had driven 4,000 people into an uninhabitable region of space, had sustained 312,000 people through 4 generations, had fueled 11 years of patient, quiet relationship building with 17 different species, had produced the calm, undefeated woman sitting across the table from them and the young man at her right hand who had met them in neutral space and let them believe for a week that they were the ones running the negotiation. What happened at Meridian Station, Veth Saron said. She wasn't sure why she said it, it wasn't in the agenda. The forces that held position for 72 hours, they knew what they were doing. Adiz looked at her. Yes, she said, they knew they weren't going to survive. Yes. And they knew what their survival would have cost. The corridor would have closed, the convoy wouldn't have gotten through. Yes, they chose it. Yes, a pause, they all chose it. It wasn't an order, there was no command structure left to give an order. Each of them made a decision independently in their own vessel, in their own situation, and they all made the same decision. Adiz's voice was the same as it had been throughout, level, clear. But there was something underneath it now that Veth Saron was finally close enough and attentive enough to hear, not grief, because grief was the wrong word, but something adjacent to it, something that had been carried for a long time by someone who understood exactly what it meant to be here because of what those people had done. They all understood the math. The Kreth Vali understood the math. The conclave analysts understood the math. Everyone understood the math. The only people who behaved as though the math didn't determine the outcome were the ones at the stations. Why? Veth Saron asked, and she knew the word was inadequate, knew it was the wrong unit of measure for what she was trying to ask, but she asked it anyway. Adiz looked at her for a moment, not measuring her, not calculating, something simpler. Because the people on those ships weren't fighting for themselves, she said. They were fighting for people who didn't exist yet. For children who hadn't been born yet, for a civilization that was a question mark that might not happen, that they would never see. She paused. You fight differently when you're not trying to preserve yourself. You fight for something you can't even fully imagine, and it turns out, she stopped, began again. It turns out that that is a very difficult thing to plan against, very difficult to counter, very difficult to predict. A pause. The conclave never modeled for it because it doesn't fit any rational behavior framework. No civilization does it consistently. No species has demonstrated it as a structural characteristic. Except humans, Veth Saron said. Except humans, Adiz agreed. The negotiations lasted another 3 weeks. Yi-Wan spent most of them in conversations he was not fully authorized to have, because the formal negotiation process could only move at the speed of institutions, and institutions moved at the speed of caution, and caution was appropriate and necessary and also not how he was built. He talked to researchers, to conclave military analysts who wanted to understand things that weren't in the agenda, to a historian who had spent 30 years studying the final phase of the cascading engagement, and who, when Yuan sat across from him in a small room on Deck 4 of the Equinox, and told him what the strategy at Meridian Station had actually been, went completely silent for a long time and then said in a voice that was trying not to shake, "We told ourselves they were desperate. We needed them to be desperate." "I know," Yi-Wan said. "It was easier to," the historian stopped. "It was easier to believe that, yes. We didn't help you, no, and you came back anyway." Yi-Wan looked at him. He thought about his grandmother at 9 years old on a ship in the null band. He thought about the things she had told him, not as lessons, not as speeches, but as the ordinary content of a life. The way she talked about what it was like to grow up in a place designed to kill you and to grow up anyway, and to understand from a very young age that the future was not given but built, that it existed only in the decisions made by people who would not live to see it. "We came back," he said, "because this is where we're from and because we had something to offer." A pause. "And because 4,000 people walked into a dark place so that we could." "I'm sorry," the historian said. "I know," Yi-Wan said. "We know," he paused. "What you do with that is the interesting question." On the last day of the preliminary contact meetings, Veth Saron stood alone in the observation deck of the Equinox, looking at the stars, at the normal movement of light in the deep, at the absolute ordinariness of space in every direction. She had filed a report that morning. It was the most difficult thing she had written in 12 years of service, not because the facts were hard to assemble but because she kept running up against the edge of what institutional language could contain. She had written about the human proposal, the population numbers, the established settlements, the 17 relationships built over 11 years in the quiet at the edge of the null band. She had written about the founding population model and what it meant for conclave membership structure. She had not written, because there was no form that asked for it, about the particular feeling she had carried since reading the Meridian Station records. The feeling of holding something that wouldn't fit any category she'd been trained to use. The feeling of understanding, slowly and irrevocably, that the gap in the conclave's records, the absence where humanity had been, was not an emptiness. It was a compression. 117 years folded into 4,000 people folded into 11 ships, unfolding now across the table from her, with the patience of a species that had learned patience not as a virtue but as a structural necessity, as a thing you became when you had no choice but to build slowly towards something you couldn't fully see. She thought about what the conclave had been afraid of in the old records, the way the word threshold had anchored every analysis. The way every military projection had built around the expected moment when humans would do what every rational civilization did: assess the cost, accept the outcome, stop. They had never stopped. At Meridian Station they hadn't stopped. In the null band, losing 40% in 11 years, they hadn't stopped. For 117 years of silence they hadn't stopped. And now they were here. Not where they'd been before the cascading engagement, not the species the conclave had failed to protect, not the civilization that had made enemies efficiently and made peace clumsily, not the unpredictable variable in every calculation. Something else. Something that had been made in the dark by people who had chosen the dark because it was the only path to a future worth arriving at. The galaxy had concluded that humanity was finished. The galaxy had been doing its careful choreography for 117 years, 11 species in practice coordination, the quiet holding everything in place. And somewhere in that quiet, in the dark at the edge of what was considered navigable, a species had been asking itself a question every single day: are we surviving or are we building? And the answer every day had been the same. She looked at the stars for a long time. She thought about the children who hadn't been born yet. The ones the people at Meridian Station had fought for, not fought to protect, because protecting implies something that already exists, but fought to create space for, fought so that the possibility of them could exist, fought for a generation that was a question mark in the dark. Those children were grown now. They were sitting across tables in neutral space, measuring the galaxy with a patience that the galaxy had not yet learned to read correctly. They were proposing relationships rather than alliances, structures rather than transactions, futures rather than arrangements. They were doing it without triumph, without bitterness, with the plain steadiness of people who had been shaped by an understanding that most civilizations never reached because most civilizations never had to pay for it. She thought about what Adiz Obi had said and what she hadn't said, what lived in the space between the words. We fight differently when we're fighting for something we can't fully imagine. The conclave would have to decide what to do with humanity's proposal. There would be arguments, there would be concerns. There would be 11 species running their own calculations, their own projections, their own assessments of what humanity represented now. Not the loud, expansive, collision-prone species they had once been, but something quieter and more deliberate and in some ways more difficult to categorize and therefore more difficult to be entirely comfortable about. She would support the proposal. She already knew that. She had known it since reading the civilian movement records, since understanding what Meridian Station had actually been, since sitting in a corridor with a 26-year-old man who had grown up in the null band and who had met a conclave delegation in neutral space and been patient with them for a week while they tried to offer him something he didn't need. The galaxy had thought humanity was extinct. The galaxy had looked at 4,000 people jumping into the dark and seen a final act. It had not occurred to anyone, not to the Kreth Valley, not to the conclave, not to a single analyst in 117 years of careful record keeping, that 4,000 people with enough seeds and enough knowledge and enough of something that didn't have a name in any language she spoke, some quality that burned past every rational threshold and kept burning, might be enough, might be in fact exactly enough, not to survive, to build something the galaxy would have to learn to reckon with. She was still standing at the observation deck window when the stars outside shifted slightly, a thruster adjustment, the equinox maintaining position, and in the movement she thought of Meridian Station, of people in dying ships holding a corridor open for 72 hours, of the question that one of them had answered in 3 words that no analyst had fully understood until now. We're keeping you here, not fighting, not resisting, keeping, as if space itself were something you could hold for someone else. As if the future were a door you could prop open with your body and trust that someone on the other side was running. They had been running. For 117 years they had been running, and here they were.